All right. We're going to begin with the word of prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for this wonderful day you've blessed us with to be here and worship you. And please be with Mrs. Christy Williams and the twins she's carrying and help them make it out safely and healthy. And please be with Mr. Roger and help him battle his cancer. And please be with the Floreses as they're mourning the loss of Mr. David. And please help the speaker tonight to have a ready recollection of all of his words. And thank you for sending your son to die on the cross for our sins. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, good evening. Our song before the lesson this evening is going to be number 72, Be With Me, Lord.
Good evening, everybody. It's good to be here. A couple of unique things from you. First, I want to start off by saying I sat in just a little bit of Jack's class this evening, and they talked about prayer, and we mentioned ready recollection, and I wanted to give Cody a shout. He was being very thoughtful about his prayer. He asked me many times about what to pray for, and I know your heart was in the right place, so it was good. It was not what we would consider vain repetition. It's just the way you imagined it coming out of your mouth. So it's fine. It all worked out good, and thank you. Thank you to Hudson. Again, it's good to see these young men. You had to be at class, Steve. If you don't understand, come to class. You'd understand better. So thanks for the young men that are willing to participate. Also, this is my first time ever that I can recall, at least. And I'm 48, so there's a chance I might have missed something, that I've ever been in front of the congregation on Super Bowl Sunday evening on the West Coast, which is a difficult time slot for preachers or teachers. Jack, I'm sure, has felt this before. In that there's many, not all, and maybe half, are itching to get out of here and go watch the game. And I promise you that you will get out of here at some point tonight. So you will get to watch the game at some point, but we're still going to move forward with the material that we need to cover, irregardless of what's happening on outside of the building. So if you want to, you can turn your Bible to Galatians chapter 2. We're going to do some flipping around. We're going to look a little bit at Acts, which we continue to do. We look at the account of Paul's life through Acts and see how it matches up with Galatians. And in Galatians 2, I don't want to jump into it. I have this desire to just jump right into it, but I do want to do a little bit of precursory things. Like, for instance, memory verse. Somebody tell me where it is found, not what it says. Out loud, not in sign language. 2:20, Galatians 2:20, correct. If you didn't know that, that's the answer. And we're going to talk about this verse tonight and the significance of the verse in the context of the arguments that Paul's making. And does anybody want to boldly, not necessarily stand up, but proclaim the memory verse from their seat to demonstrate themselves apt to remember the memory verse that has been assigned? Penny wants to do it. live in the flesh. I live by faith. I live by faith. Anyone want to pick it up? And gave himself for me. Okay. So this is our memory verse, and great job. I appreciate you, Penny, and now you will even remember it even better after this evening. But as a little bit of context, again, chapter 2 is the continuation of some material that started in chapter 1, and so we'll take a little bit of mental step backwards and not necessarily physically go back too much and read. But Paul begins his defense. So again, context-wise, Paul's writing to the Galatians. The Galatians had a problem. A big problem in that Paul went and taught them, converted many of them, established churches in Antioch. I consider Antioch part of Galatia. If you don't, you could be right. That's fine. Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. They established churches. Who was with Paul on his trip when he did that? Barnabas. I won't even wait for you to answer. I'll just give you the answer. It was Barnabas. Were there other people there with him? Potentially. We don't know them. But Paul and Barnabas established churches in Galatia. They left Galatia. Basically, they went into Galatia, headed east, went back west, and left. And then right behind them came in some false teachers. These are Jewish, and I do this in air quotes. If you're listening, you won't see these air quotes. Christians came in behind Paul and were teaching that Jesus was the Savior. And all you needed to do is believe and have faith in Jesus and be circumcised and keep the old law, and you'd be saved. And that's what these teachers were coming in, and they were very persuasive. So much so that Paul's response to what had happened was that he was amazed. He loved these brethren. They were his children in the faith. He helped convert them, bring them to Christ. And yet, their minds were changed. It seemingly, Paul had left town, and these men had swooped in and were teaching a little adjusted version of the message that Paul proclaimed. And their story was, well, Paul didn't tell you what the real gospel was. He got the real gospel from Peter, but he changed it. It's something like that. So this is me creating what could have been said by these false teachers. They're making accusations against Paul, bringing into doubt whether he was truly an apostle, whether they're bringing into doubt where he actually got the gospel from. And I'm actually on this next slide. And Paul defends himself. He says, at the very in chapter 1, he says, the gospel that I was given was not created by man. This wasn't some device or some message that man elaborately sat down and planned out. He didn't get it from man. It wasn't created by man. It wasn't taught to him by the apostles. Again, this is in chapter 1. If you want to see the context for this, 1 in verse 12 through 17. He didn't get it from any of the apostles. Nobody taught it to him. And he'll make the case on how he met with Peter, but he was only there for a very short amount of time. But he does say that he got it directly from Jesus. And the Galatian Christians knew this story already, but he was reminding them. He was reminding them, I didn't get taught this. This wasn't something somebody else gave to me. Somebody didn't coerce me into changing my life. Jesus came. God appointed me and designated a time for Jesus to come and to reveal himself to him, that is Paul. And from there, Paul was converted. On the road to Damascus, Paul was a changed man at that place. He came to that place as a Jew that hated Christianity, that hated the way, that wanted to stomp it out, thought that it was a complete rejection of the law which God had gave, and God was still wanted to continue. And so they were wanting to stomp it out as some false religion that we could just do away with, and once we were able to defeat it, it would never pop back up again. That was Paul when he got onto the road to Damascus. In fact, why was he going to Damascus? To kill and imprison people. He was going to actually imprison them, or actually he was going to bring them in chains back to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem, bad stuff would happen to him. So that was his goal. He was going with the purpose to do harm. Ananias and the brethren in Damascus knew this. They knew that this guy was trouble, and I think they had a sense that he was coming their direction. But on that road, he was converted. Jesus showed himself to him. I want to say he saw the light, because he literally did see the light. It wasn't a metaphor. He saw the light, and he was converted. And it says, where did he directly go after his conversion? Well, he went to Damascus, and Ananias taught him. He was baptized in Damascus, and where did he go? Arabia. We don't know how long he spent in Arabia. He spent time in Arabia. good guess is to say that he had visions, or he was given the message of the gospel from Christ in Arabia. We don't know for sure. He came back to Damascus and was continued to teach. So he's teaching in Damascus. Eventually, Barnabas comes and grabs him, brings him over to Antioch in Antioch of Pisidia. No, is that right? Antioch of Arabia. No, what is Syria? It's the one that's close to Tarsus. There's Antioch that's what? Caesarea. Antioch of Syria and Antioch of Pisidia. Pisidia is the one that's up north. I should have a map, being the map guy. But so he's in Antioch and Tarsus teaching with Barnabas. And he goes and tells the story of the only time that I went down to Jerusalem was after 3 years of being converted. I'd been a convert for 3 years, and I went down to Jerusalem, and I spent time with Peter, and he got to know Peter. And we'll get into in just a second the reason that he was only there for 15 days. But he went down there and met with Peter, and the only other person that he met of the apostles was James, and that was the Lord's brother, James. And so he didn't really get to know anybody. He had 15 days. The chances that anyone could be taught the full gospel and be able to preach it in 15 days is very, very slim. So I think that that's the argument he's making. I didn't spend much time with Peter. He didn't impart anything to me. It sounds like from his description of the visit, it was to get to know him better on a personal level. And then as proof, he uses evidence the fact that he spent time in Jerusalem. He left and went back to Tarsus. He never met any of the brethren from Judea, according to chapter 1. But yet, when they heard about his conversion, that Saul to them was this man that was persecuting the church, had changed his mind and completely did a 180 and was now serving Jesus and preaching Christ crucified as the Savior. It caused them to glorify God. So Paul is making this defense saying, hey, I went and did these things, and the Christians supported me, and the Christians glorified God because of me. And then we jump in to chapter 11. And in chapter 2, 11 years later. So it says 14, but I see that as an additional 11 years, so 14 years total from his conversion. So Paul was converted on on year 0 AD. This would be 14 AD that he would be making this new trip down to Jerusalem. So that's 11 years that he spent in Antioch and Tarsus and potentially other places preaching God's gospel, or preaching the gospel of Jesus. Sorry, let me flip my notes to make sure I keep up with myself. So he's spending 11 years up there. So the question, why was it 11 years? Why did he spend 11 years? And we can answer that pretty quickly. If you want to turn in your Bibles to Acts chapter 22, we're going to be in verse 17. Paul here is talking, but the context of this passage, this is a long time after Paul's conversion, after the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, after his first and second missionary trips, his third missionary trip. Paul goes into Jerusalem knowing that he's going to be arrested, he's going to be bound. He goes into Jerusalem and into the temple and is teaching in the temple, and a riot happens. And he's actually saved by the Romans because there was a riot and they wanted to kill him in the temple. And he's saved and he addresses the crowd in the temple. And this is his explanation about what happened to him. He tells them about his conversion. And then when we start in verse 17 of Acts 22, it says, "When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, 'Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me.' And I said, 'Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles.'" So, again, I'm making a fair guess that this is during Paul's visit to Jerusalem to visit Peter. He was in the temple. Jesus tells him, "You need to get out of here. They're not going to listen to you." And Paul, it seems like he was surprised, right? He was a Jew of Jews. These men knew him. These people around him knew him. Why wouldn't they believe him? They know him. They know what he did. They should see that he had a change of heart and a change of mind, and he would be able to do such good. But Jesus knew better, and Jesus had appointed him to go. And not only go, but far away, and he ends up going back to Antioch, and ultimately over into his missionary work, which is to Asia Minor and into Europe. So Jesus sent him away. That's why it took so long. And the reason that he came back 11 years later was because God told him to. If we pick up back into Galatians, if you want to turn back there in 2, it says in verse 2, I went up because of I should take a step backwards. He went to Jerusalem with Barnabas and Titus along. So he took them along with him. And then in verse 2, he said, I went up because of revelation and set before them, though privately before those who had seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaimed among the Gentiles. So God told him to go. By revelation, he was told him to go. So I want to take a little bit of a quick sidebar, and Jack and I are going to have a disagreement here. But we all can disagree. You all can disagree with me. I think I will make the case that it's okay. Paul makes a trip to Jerusalem. This, according to Galatians' account, this is his second trip. He's defending his interaction, or he's presenting his interaction with the apostles and explaining how many times he had been and visited with the apostles. So if we went to Acts and look for the account of this trip, there's 3 places it could be. Only 3. If you look, you don't have to turn there, but in Acts chapter 11, in verse 27, so this is when Paul was preaching with Barnabas up in Antioch. In 11 verse 20, or in Acts 11:27 says, and now in these days prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them was named Agabus. He stood up and foretold of by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. This took place in the days of Claudius. So the disciples determined, everyone according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea, and they did so, sending it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Paul. And then if you go quickly over to 12:25, this is the end of that trip. They make it down to Jerusalem. They give the brethren the money, all the things that they received from the Christians up in Antioch in that area. And then verse 25 it says, and Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had completed their service, bringing with them John, whose other name was Mark. So this is one place it could be. You'll find that as we look at the account of Galatians, some of the things match up in Acts 11 and 12 and others to Acts 15. And this is where Jack talked about it this morning. He referred to Galatians 2, which I was worried when he started talking about Galatians that he was going to take material from me, but he added to me rather than, and Peter will say that anyway, I don't want to get too far in it. I don't waste too much time just blathering. But in Acts 15 is another trip that Paul and Barnabas, and this time in Acts 15, they have Titus with them. In Acts 15, you remember, this is where men from Judea come into Jerusalem. We've already talked about this. Men from Judea actually go into Antioch and start talking about you have to be circumcised in order to be saved. And there's a lot of disagreement, and the church sent men down, including Paul and Barnabas, down to Jerusalem to discuss the matter with the elders and apostles down in Jerusalem. So this could be that trip too. So we either have Acts 11, Acts 15, and the third is a catch-all. It could be sometime that's not mentioned in Acts. It could be a trip that is not recorded. So if you pick 3, there's a good chance that you're right, because that's like a catch-all. If it's not one of the other 2, it's the third. I won't say where. I'll let you figure out for you where you think that is. Again, Jack said this morning, I think he sees it as Acts 15 trip for the Jerusalem Council, and there's things that match up, and that works fine. My case would be either of the 2 that were actually in Acts would match up. It could be either of the 2. So we'll leave it at that. Sidebar done. Okay. So Paul is going down to Jerusalem. He's going because God told him to. And there's another reason he says in Galatians that we just read, he was going to present the gospel to some of the brethren in Jerusalem. And he says he did it privately. He did it privately, and I think we'll see he did it with 3 guys. He had this meeting with 3 guys. It would be Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, and John, the son of Zebedee. Believe that these are the 3 guys that he talks with in the context of chapter 2. This is the guys that Paul's meeting with. And so he goes down there and he presents this to them. The purpose, he also states, was then to prevent error. He said in the part of chapter or verse 2 that I didn't read, it says, the gospel that he was proclaiming to the Gentile, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. So Paul was making the case that this idea, this gospel that is being preached by certain individuals, that you had to be circumcised to follow the old law, it was not compatible with his message. So if it was circumcision, I don't want it to be circumcision and me running this race saying that you don't need to be circumcised and for it to be in vain, for it to be purposeless. So there was no way that those two lines of teaching intersected. They didn't intersect it anywhere. When you added onto the old law onto Jesus, it defeated the reason that Jesus was sacrificed. And I don't want to get too far because he'll make more arguments for that. But so that was another one of the reasons that he was down there. He wanted to stop what was happening. And he wanted to expose some false brothers. He also says, and this is interesting to me, because I believe that we see this today. He says that there, in verse 4, I know we're skipping over 3 and we'll come back to it, but in verse 4 he says, because of false brothers secretly brought in who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus so that they might bring us into slavery. So are these, he calls them false brothers. The Greek word here is pseudadelphos. Don't ask me to say that again. And it means, or by definition says, one who ostentatiously professes to be a Christian, but is destitute of Christian knowledge and piety. What was a term we'd use for somebody like that? A wolf in sheep's clothing. This is somebody that's coming in, espousing to be one thing, and actually intending to become something completely different than that. So looking on the appearance, and by word they were calling themselves Christians, by deed, and by thought, they were not. They knew little to nothing about the true message of the gospel, but were just looking to push forward an agenda, to push forward a line of thinking. And I was trying to remember. There was a version, the New English Standard Bible calls them pseudo-Christians, fake Christians, something like that. And I think that that's something you can apply to a lot of people today. You would ask your friends, oh, I'm a Christian. A lot of people will say that they're a Christian. But when pressed to ask what they really believe, they don't believe in following Christ. They believe in religiosity to make themselves feel better about themselves. But it's not a true faith. If you turn back to 2 Peter in chapter 2, you don't have to, but if you want to, you can. Peter himself is writing specifically towards the end of his life. The book of Peter is written towards the end of Peter's life, and he mentions that. He knows that he's about to die. But he's warning Christians, because the book of 2 Peter is written to Christians. He says, in 2 Peter 2 and verse 1, he says, but false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing up for themselves swift destruction. This is Peter learns his lesson, because this is written, Peter writes this letter long after his interaction that's recorded in Galatians chapter 2, but he sees now, towards the end of his life, that there are always going to be people that are coming in to bring in false messages, to lead others astray, or to pick off, what I would say, if we're following the analogy with the wolf in sheep's clothing, to pick off the weak members of the flock in order to lead them to their destruction. So these men were coming in, and I read in one of the commentaries, this is a thing that Paul, I think it was probably his arch nemesis. If you think like superheroes, like Spider-Man has who's his arch nemesis? Some Green Goblin. Okay, every Batman has the Joker. You know, all of these superheroes have their nemesis, and this would be Paul's arch nemesis would be these false teachers, because we'll see consistently through the epistles that he writes, the letters that he writes to the churches, there are these men that follow him around and just try to contradict what he says, try to change what his message is, try to attack his personality, try to attack his personal history, and try to prevent him from being successful in spreading the gospel. Were they successful, the false teachers? No. They were not successful. But yet, he still was dogged by them. In fact, when Paul lists all of the horrible things he went to, right, he's listing shipwrecks and being stoned and being beaten and so many different things. One of those things that listed on there was perils from false brothers. It was one of the things that he knew he was always had to be aware of and be wary of. And so he makes you understand better when he's checking in with his the people that he helped convert, the people that he led to Christ. He always is showing the sincere care and concern that he knows. He knows that these people are going to come in, they're going to try to pervert the gospel, they're going to try to carry them away, and he's continually checking in and praising them when they're able to get past that, when they're able to go beyond that, when they're able to see through the lies of these false teachers. But again, this is something that Paul and Peter, as we see in 2 Peter, had to deal with on a lifelong basis. So we fool ourselves in thinking, oh, this is not a modern issue. This isn't something that we have to worry about today. This is absolutely, when you don't worry about it, or you don't think about it, or you don't look out for it, is when Satan is most successful. So we need to be aware of that. But it's also interesting to see, to me, Paul's approach to these false teachers, to these men. When he is able to see them face to face, what is his response to them? Does he acquiesce? Does he compromise? Well, I'll tell you the answer. If you look at I have it written down. Verse 5. Sorry. In verse 5, what does he say? How long did they have patience with them? How long did they put up with the false teaching? Not a moment. So if you take the shortest amount of time, for us today, like when I was a kid, we used to say, like not for a nanosecond. That was the shortest amount of time we could comprehend. Like something you couldn't even blink an eye. That's how fast that is. Paul didn't put it, for him it's a moment, not for a second, not for any period of time. Paul did not cease to combat that, to contradict the false teaching, to fight against the false teaching. And why did he do that? It says in verse 5. Somebody tell me, why did he do that? So the truth of the gospel can be maintained for who? For the Galatians, right? It's for the Galatians. It's for the church in Ephesus. It's for those in Thessalonica. It's for Christians. But here specifically, he was fighting for the Galatians. He was fighting for the truth of the gospel to reach them and to not be corrupted. And yet, he is still so surprised when they gave in. And as I think about Paul and I kind of reflect for myself personally, I'm sure it was more of a disappointment, a lack of willingness to at least push against the ebb, against the tide of this false teaching. Because he says he was astonished how quickly they turned. Would he have been upset if they put up a battle and turned and gave in? He would have been upset. But he was even more frustrated by the fact that they had known the truth and they had departed from it so quickly and easily. So when difficult times came up, and we'll see, the Galatians weren't the only ones. He makes an example of Peter. Peter did the exact same thing. When difficult time came, Peter gave in. And we'll talk about that in a second. But his trip to Jerusalem ended with a specific accomplishment that I think Jack spoke to elegantly, effectively this morning, as Paul went into Jerusalem, met with Peter and James and John, presented to them the gospel. And again, he says, it didn't matter it was Peter, James, and John. It didn't matter what their standing was. The Catholics will say, well, he's meeting with Peter because Peter was the leader of the church and the first pope, or the first, head of the church. Paul makes specifically clear it didn't matter what their titles were. It meant nothing to Paul. It didn't matter what their standing was amongst the church. He just knew that they were influential, and they would help him in his purpose of one gospel, of one message of unity. That's why they were useful to him. So he met with them, and he presented it to them. And what was the result? What was Peter and James and John's reaction to that message? What did they do? That right hand of fellowship, they extended out. Like, I imagine this big handshake and really representing the fact that we are on the same page. We are fighting the same battle. We are on the same team. What you said is exactly what we say. What you said, we completely agree with. Sorry, I need to do a click here. What you said is what should be taught, and is what is being taught. So continue on. And he says they didn't add anything. They didn't say, well, you're a little off here. Add this a little bit onto there. Maybe if you're a little less strict about circumcision and say, whether you choose to or not, that's your choice. There was no flex. They didn't add. He says, they added nothing to me. So that wasn't Peter saying, I met with these really important guys and it wasn't that big of a deal to me. That's not what he's saying. He said, I met with these guys that were going to help me, they added nothing to my message. I presented my case for the gospel that Jesus revealed to me, that Jesus gave to me, and they said, yes, that is the gospel message. And they extended that right hand of fellowship, and they agreed that what Peter was doing should be done. And they went as far as to say, we see now that your directive, the responsibility that was given to you was to go to the Gentiles, and Peter and ostensibly the rest of the apostles in Jerusalem at that time were to take the message to the Jews. So I guess my question to you, this is a fun thing to think about, and I'm interested in what you guys would say, and there's no wrong answer. So I'll preempt this question with no wrong answer. So Paul is going to the Jews, and Peter to the circumcision. Who do you think had the easier job? If you were to say, oh man, you get to go to the Jews, that's the easy one. Or you get to go to the Gentiles, that's the easier one. And if you have an answer to that, maybe no one will answer. Why do you think that? Again, there's no wrong answer. You could say, I will tell you right now my answer. I think Paul had the easier job because he's going to people with no baggage as far as service to the one true God. And so this was new teaching to them, whereas we know the Jews really, really, really struggled with getting over the old law being done away with. And it was a continual struggle for them throughout the New Testament and into the end of the Bible. Anybody think that Peter had the easier job and the other apostles? Yeah.
I was just going to say, so you've got 12, however many we have left at this point in time. Only one is going to the Gentiles. So it even gives the impression it's like, all right, you go ahead and go to the Gentiles, and we'll cover the Jews, even though they're a much smaller proportion of the population that they're spreading this message to.
But you can also see too that it wasn't as if Paul didn't teach the Jews, because when he went into cities, he went first to the synagogue and he started there, and typically he was rejected, and then he went to the Gentiles. But Saul was the source of a reason that there were Jews throughout this area, right? He played hand in the persecution that caused many of the believers in Jerusalem, which after Pentecost and the conversion in the beginning of Acts, there was how many Christians at the last count was? Right, one day, and they continued to grow, it says, and they were all of like mind, and they were growing. So there was a lot, and this persecution starts, and a lot of them left, and it says they all left except the apostles. I would imagine there's more in Jerusalem than just the apostles left, but the apostles were doing work. So they had a hard job, right? Even if there's 12 of them, they're in Jerusalem in a place that is very anti-Jesus, very anti-Jesus as the Christ. But Paul was sent to the Gentiles. He had plenty of help, right? We think, there's 12 and 1, but we have Barnabas and we have Titus and we have Timothy ultimately. We could list on and on. We know a bunch of names of people that we don't know much about other than like Erastus. We know he was from Corinth, but we don't know much else about him. And there's a bunch of other bit players that we don't know much about, and maybe they weren't bit players, but we don't know what level of involvement they had in the ministry. But Paul went down to Jerusalem, again, after a considerable period of time post his conversion, and ultimately the result was, I presented the gospel that I understood and that was given to me, and the disciple and Peter and James and John agreed. So these guys that are coming in and saying, but Peter gave Paul a message and he changed it because Peter is Jewish, and so therefore he would be pro the old law and circumcision. And now Paul is saying circumcision isn't anything. here Paul is saying, I spoke to these guys, brought them the message, and they understood, and they agreed. How do we know that Peter was aware that the Gentiles were saved? Well, before I even finish the question, Acts what?
Well, that's going through my behind the whole time you're talking, because I think all the other apostles also taught the Gentiles as well. The first one who's actually called to do it was Peter or Cornelius.
I think.
So, when you talk about teaching the Gentiles, teaching the Jews, I think at some point, I think that it doesn't matter. They're just teaching.
Absolutely.
And I think one example in my mind that comes up a lot is John. I think John obviously was going to a lot of Gentiles because he ends up that part of the world where he's over in, Patmos, when he wrote Revelation. So I think when I think about it, I think, yeah, I mean, at this point when he's talking in Galatians 2, later on where he talks about Peter and confronting him, I think Peter's doing this thing where he's obviously two-faced a little bit about it, like hanging out with the Gentiles sometimes, but then when there's more Jews around, he kind of hangs out with them and does a little clique thing, and it's a thing, to a point where he even says it pulled Barnabas to that.
Right.
But I think that's just part of our, the same way that Paul kicks against the goads, Peter's kicking against the goads about this particular thing. Like it's something that's hard for him to grasp. There's conflicting thoughts about this because he's still trying to reconcile it in his head, the change and why it's not just the Jews and
Right.
and that's human nature, right? We work hard to deal with those cognitive biases or the cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to make it make sense, and so I think that this is just shows that Peter's humanity. He's a human. He's still trying to deal with that cognitive dissonance.
Well, I mean, if any of the apostles, well, we don't see a lot into the deep character of a lot of the apostles, but if anyone demonstrated that these guys were human, was Peter. Because he's the guy we can relate to, and we'll get into it. And you already jumped a little bit ahead, Steve, but I won't punish you for that. But so Acts 10, to answer that question, 10 and 11, Cornelius is converted. Peter, not only was Peter paramount in the involvement, he went to Cornelius, was sent to Cornelius. Cornelius came and got him anyway. And he was part of the first Gentile convert, but he stayed. What were Gentiles to Jews? True Gentiles, or what were Gentiles to true Jews?
Persona non grata.
Unclean. You go into their house, you're unclean. You touch them, you're unclean. What else to Jews was unclean? Which you kind of make that, what they considered. Well, the dead bodies were unclean. You touched a dead body, you had to have the cleansing. So, Gentiles were on par with dead bodies, were dead Jewish bodies. And so they had wanted nothing to do with him. But when Cornelius was converted, we see in that account that Peter stayed with him for 3 days. Did he stay outside of his house and sleep in a tent and not go anywhere near him? No, he was with them. In fact, it says later when he's defending himself in front of the Jews in Jerusalem, he says he dined with them. He ate with them. He was in their house. And they were very surprised and taken aback, and a lot of the Pharisees were not happy about it. But Peter knew this. Peter was involved. And let's understand as we go into the next part, there's no lack of knowledge on Peter's part. It is very willful, the decisions that he made. It wasn't because we can't say it's because he didn't understand, he didn't fully comprehend. And I do think that this is, when we look at the interaction with Peter, maybe where this trip that Paul took, where it lines up, whether it is Acts 11 or Acts 15, maybe plays a little bit of an important role, because did the Jerusalem Council already, and the decision that was passed from the Jerusalem Council already go out to all the churches? And if it did, that maybe plays a different role in Peter's kind of abandoning his Gentile brethren, and we'll get into it in a second. So, real quickly, and I think also too, I wanted to respond to your comment, Steve. Absolutely, I think that they had a ministry that was directed towards Gentiles and Jews, but that didn't make them exclusive to. The good news, the gospel was presented to any willing and interested party, and actually to many that were unwilling and uninterested. So there wasn't you're a Jew, I got to wait for Peter to get here for him to talk to you. It was just that their ministries Paul's was directed away from Jerusalem, and Peter's was centered in Jerusalem. So, again, combating, making this argument against these false teachers, accusations against Paul. He's making it very clear that he was endorsed, he had fellowship, he was in lockstep with the message that was coming out of Jerusalem from Peter and any of the other apostles. And then as we jump into verse 11, we have this incident that occurs. Where it happens, we don't know. Did it happen pre-Acts 15 or post-Acts 15? Personally, I'll give you my personal opinion on this one. I like to give Peter in my mind, the benefit of the doubt and think that it happened before, but you can make the case that even if it had happened and Peter was involved in a decision to say that circumcision was nothing, it doesn't mean that he would not cave when faced with pressure, because we see that he did during Jesus' trial. He had made clear that I don't accuse Peter because I can't say that I would do anything different, but Peter, when faced with peer pressure, did not typically respond well. But this incident, we don't know much about it other than this is the only place that it's recorded in Galatians chapter 2. And as the account goes in verse 11, and it sounds like when Paul's telling this that he's already told this incident to the Galatians before, it rings that to me when he kind of just jumps right into what happened. In verse 11 it says, "But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned." It doesn't tell much about the backstory. He goes to the backstory after that statement. So I would assume that they knew something about it. But again, that's me interjecting. Take it for what it's worth. But the facts of the matter remain. Sorry, get me caught up in my notes again. Peter comes up to Antioch. He comes from Jerusalem. And remember, when people were coming from Jerusalem to Antioch, were they going up or down? Down. And it's about 300 miles. I was supposed to mention that in that map that I had. It's about 300 miles from Jerusalem to Antioch. And that's not a short trip by foot. So it's a commitment, right? You're not walking to the Garden of Gethsemane or over to Bethlehem. This is a long trip. And depending on how you are, how much of a practicing Jew you are, if you were going north, often you had to go east and then north and then west and north because you wanted to skip over Samaria. But in this instance, it says that they didn't, well, no, maybe I'm thinking about Paul. But regardless, 300 miles, Peter goes up into Antioch, and he develops a relationship with them. Again, he had experience with Cornelius, so he understood that the Gentiles were not unclean. He knew that he could dine with them, that they were on par, on the same level as Jews, on the same level. The playing field had been leveled. Jesus had leveled the playing field for everyone. Those that were the children of God were those that had faith and followed after Jesus. No longer were they the Hebrew nation. So he comes to visit Peter. He eats with the Gentiles. He acts normal, like you would imagine. Bring in a preacher. He comes and eats with us. You know, preachers got to eat, right, Jack? Preachers got to eat. You know, it's the preacher's due to get paid. You don't muzzle the ox when they're grinding the grain. You let them eat. And so he was full on 100% into the Gentile experience or in relationship. He had a relationship with them. He didn't cut them off. But then there are some well-known or some known men were coming from Judea. It says from James, but if we look back in Acts 15, which might lead to the case that this is Acts 15 trip or post-Acts 15 trip, or this happens before Acts 15, excuse me, because at Acts 15, James said, in Acts 15, in verse 24, it says, James says to Paul that he heard that there were men that were coming up to Antioch and causing a problem and causing a stir with false teaching, and he wanted to make sure that he gave no instruction for these men to do that. So in Acts 15, James says he wasn't involved. So how James is related, we don't know, but they came with that authority. And James, being the brother of Jesus, he carried a lot of cachet, his name with him, right? So if you said I was from James, people would take it seriously. So these men came up. They made Peter nervous. They caused him to be afraid of what would happen if he didn't join with them. And so as a result, Peter removes himself from the Christians. It says, the word there that's used to describe that is that he abandoned them. He retreated from them. He left them. It makes me think of what David's army did to Uriah. Yes, man, I hate when you have to think of names and it just doesn't come. But Uriah, remember they went up into the battle. It was hot and heavy, and then David told the men to retreat, to retreat from Uriah, and Uriah was left to fight by himself and died. And this is what Peter did here. He removed himself. And we have to understand the context for the application for ourselves too. When we involve ourselves in poor decision making that lead to sin, there are ramifications that extend beyond yourself. And Peter's decision to do that affected the other Jews that were there, so much so that even Barnabas. And what do we know Barnabas as? What's his name? What does that mean? The son of encouragement. This is the guy that sold what he had in order to support the church when it just started. And when I think about a guy that was all in, Barnabas was all in. And yet when he saw this and he saw Peter do this, it influenced him to be involved in it as well. And Barnabas had been next to Paul the whole time they had these discussions, these debates on, and fighting against these teachers that say that salvation with circumcision, and you need to be circumcised in order to be saved. Barnabas was there, and yet this fear really took a deep seed inside their hearts, and they removed themselves and backed away from the Gentiles. And I like to think, what did those Gentiles feel like? Have you ever been abandoned? Like, even if you think back to your childhood, had a friend, was on your side, and then next thing you know, he joined somebody else that was making fun or causing a problem for you, and they joined that side, and how lonely it feels. Imagine how Jesus felt in the garden when all he asked was his best friends to stay with him, and they couldn't. It's that sense of complete abandonment. In today's day and age, what would those Gentiles have done? More than likely, I think with our snowflake type of mentality,
Cancel culture.
they would have said, this is religion. I don't want religion. Forget it. If they're going to be fake like that, there's no such thing as fake Christians. I don't want anything to do with that. But yet, we don't see that. Now, whether that happened or not, we don't see that. But Paul, or as a result, I think it's interesting to see Peter stood condemned. So based on his action, Paul says to him, you are in a condemned status. You are heading towards hell if you remain the same. And he stood up with all the courage. I can't imagine how much courage it took Paul to do this. And maybe you see Paul as just being like, I'm going to tell him like it is. But I don't see it that way. I see it as Paul speaking to his friend in a way that's difficult to say. It's difficult to tell your friends, you're messing up. And that's really kind of using poor language, but you're standing condemned. You are heading towards hell.
You're in sin.
And if you don't change, your destination is made clear. So Paul does this, and I'm running out of time, so we're going to end here real quickly. If we look at this is not the end of Paul's arguments and statements to Peter, and we'll continue on this next time. But in verse 14 it says, but when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, who is Peter, before them all. So this is including Jews, Barnabas, the Jews, and the Gentiles. And he says to him, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? Yes, it's the same concept. The Jews, the hardline Jews, wanted the Gentiles to come to them. And what Jesus is saying is, come to me. And the Jews couldn't accept it. And Peter was struggling to see past this. Peter was with Jesus. He saw him die. He saw him resurrected. He baptized Cornelius. He knew all of this. Even if this was before Acts 15, Peter knew this, and yet he still caved. So, being on guard is one of our primary concerns for our salvation. We have to be aware that there's no amount of study that makes you safe. Continue to renew your minds day by day. So Peter is sitting, we're gonna leave this. This is kind of like, if you were old enough to remember when Empire Strikes Back came out, and I am, we see that Han Solo is frozen. Luke Skywalker had just got his hand cut off, and the end of the story seems very bleak, and Peter is standing condemned. Wait till next time. So we're gonna have a song, and then we'll offer the Lord's Supper for anybody that needs to partake of it.
Thank you for that lesson. He loved me so. Do me so. Why did my Savior come to earth and to the humble go? Why did he choose a lowly birth? Because he loved me so. He loved me so. He loved me so. He gave his precious life for me, because he loved me so. Till Jesus comes, I'll sing his praise, and then to glory go, and live with him through endless days, because he loved me so. He loved me so. He loved me so. He gave his precious life for me, because he loved me so. Is there anyone that needs to partake of the Lord's Supper? There is not. So.
Please pray with me. Dear Lord, thank you for us coming here tonight, Lord, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to learn a little more about your word and worship you, Lord. Thank you for bringing us Mr. Jack, Lord. He's so uplifting for all of us here, and we just really appreciate you blessing us with the opportunity to get to know him better and hear him speak when he comes up here, Lord. Thank you for letting my Uncle Sean and Abby be here with us, Lord, and please help Mr. Jack and them to travel home safely tomorrow, and just please be with us as we go out into the world, Lord. Please help us just to be a shining light for you, and that we may influence people in our lives to ask questions about why we do what we do, and hopefully they'll come to you, Lord. And thank you for sending your Son down to the earth to die across our sins. In Jesus' name, amen.